Welcome back. We've been tracking 3 questions across the course, and this week they converge. The boundary question, where does the game end and real life begin, has been dissolving since week 2. Mike and Salvo showed it was always porous. Bourdieu showed that capital crosses it in both directions. Burke showed that the same forms of value operating in real economies operate in virtual ones. This week the boundary does not just blur, it collapses entirely as an analytic object. The question is no longer whether virtual economies are real economies. It is what that means for the people labouring inside of them. The assumed player question, who does the game imagine and who does it exclude, has been building from Huizinga's unmarked Homo Ludens through Winner's imagined user, through Drenton's structural analysis of gaming's masculine default, through Fletcher's magic circle of whiteness. This week it arrives at its sharpest expression. Whose labour counts as play, and whose play counts as labour? And the play work question, seeded in week 1 with Shizmetahali and Bennett describing games as design technologies for producing flow, named in week 2 as Ludo-Capitalism, made concrete in week 7 by Burke's eBay farmers, is this week's central problem. Not as a philosophical puzzle about where one category ends and another begins, but as a material question about who gets to inhabit which side of the line and what enforces the distinction. 4 readings work together in sequence. Dibbell's 2003 Wired piece establishes that virtual economies are real economies and the line between game and work is already dissolving. His 2007 New York Times Magazine piece takes us inside a Chinese gold farm and shows that what that dissolution looks like from the shop floor. Christa Lee Malone's 2009 paper on Dragon Kill Points shows players inventing their own economic institutions to solve distribution problems the game doesn't solve. And Fickle's 2021 essay insists that you cannot talk about any of this without talking about race, that the play-work distinction is not drawn by logic but by power, and that the power in question is racial. So let's begin with A House in Britannia. Julian Dibbell opens his 2003 Wire piece with John Duggar, a wonder-bred deliveryman from Stillwater, Oklahoma, who has just paid $750 for a virtual house. 9 rooms, 3 stories, a rooftop patio, solid stonework walls, and completely imaginary, a structure in Ultima Online. One of the early generation of massively multiplayer online role-playing games. $750 is more than a week's wages for Duggar. He lives alone. He spends 5 hours a night in what he calls his dungeon, a walled-off section of his garage, watching his avatar walk through Britannia's cartoon landscape. The house has a history. It was built piece by piece by Troy Stoll, a former carpenter in Indianapolis who spent 6 months inside the game doing nothing but smithing. Clicking on hillsides to mine ore, heading to a forge to click the ore into ingots, clicking the ingots into weapons and armour, and returning to the hills to start over again. Each cycle inching his character's smithing skill fractionally closer to the Grandmaster designation. Stoll had 3 characters interlocked to support each other. A small household economy of labour division within the game. The house was a base of operations he'd saved for over months of play. When Stoll lost his job after September 11th, he sold his entire account for $500 to Bob Kiblinger, a professional virtual goods trader working from a split level in Beckley, West Virginia. Kiblinger stripped the account methodically, cataloguing every item against his mental database of current market prices, and sold the most valuable pieces on eBay over the following days. The large tower that Stoll had built through 6 months of repetitive virtual labour passed to Duggar through Kiblinger's arbitrage. Kiblinger's question is economically precise. How did a 7 kilobyte piece of digital make-believe become a $750 piece of upmarket real estate? And the answer begins with a calculation made a year earlier by the economist Edward Castronova. Castronova, an EverQuest player by night and an economist by day, published a paper in 2001 in which he took the real money trade prices of EverQuest items as a proxy for in-game property values, multiplied by the rate at which players accumulate them, and arrived at a figure for the annual economic output of EverQuest's fictional world of Norrath, $135 million, roughly on par with Bulgaria's GDP at the time. The average hourly income of playing EverQuest, measured in virtual goods that could be exchanged for real dollars, was $3.42. The poverty line for a single person in the United States was $8,794 per year. The implication, as Castronova put it with the dry precision of an economist, was that there is little reason to question, on feasibility grounds at least, that those who claim to be living and working in Norrath and not Earth may actually be doing just that. So what makes this possible? Dibbell identifies a mechanism that is elegant in its simplicity: scarcity. In a virtual world, scarcity is not a natural condition. Developers could in principle make everything infinitely available, but they don't. They deliberately engineer scarcity. Limited housing plots, rare item drops, skills that take months to master, because scarcity is what makes the world feel real and meaningful. Without it, the game would have nothing to strive for, nothing to invest in. As Castronova puts it in Dibbell's piece, the minute you hardwire constraints into a virtual world, an economy emerges. 1/1,000,000th of a second later, that economy starts interacting with ours. Scarcity is a design decision, and it is a design decision with profound economic consequences, because scarcity creates conditions for markets. And markets, Dibbell observes, seep like gas through any boundary, never mind one as porous as the line between real and make-believe. Troy Stoll's answer to why he spent 6 months doing repetitive virtual labour was, well, it's not work if you enjoy it. But that is precisely the question Dibbell is pressing on. Is enjoyment sufficient to change the character of what you are doing? Is there a meaningful difference between 6 months at the virtual forge and 6 months doing repetitive work in a factory? And if there is a difference, if the enjoyment makes it something other than labour, what does that tell us about the nature of work and play more broadly? These virtual economies, Dibbell argues, raise what he calls the question of questions, the one that in a sense asks all the others. How do we assign value to immaterial goods? What defines ownership when property becomes as fluid as thought? And above all, what defines productivity when work becomes a game and game becomes work? Scarcity is one answer. Things are valuable because they're hard to get. But that explanation immediately generates another puzzle. Why would anyone want to play a game that is hard to get things in? Why would Stoll pay $9.95 a month for the privilege of spending his evenings doing something that sounds, when described, indistinguishable from his actual job? The answer, Dibbell suggests, is that throughout human history, whenever people have tried to imagine paradise, they have pictured ease, abundance, the absence of constraint. But the worlds people actually want to be in, the ones they pay entrance fees and devote hundreds of hours to, are the ones that make things hard to get and even harder to keep. The addictive appeal of online role-playing games is the appeal of constraint. The challenge is the point. The scarcity is the feature. This is significant beyond the specific case of MMOs. It suggests something important about what value actually is. Not a property of things, but a function of the effort required to obtain them. The social recognition attached to that effort, and the systems of meaning within which that effort takes place. A Grandmaster blacksmith in Britannia is valuable not despite, but because of the 6 months of clicking it represents. The labour is the value, which means that when someone like Kiblinger buys that account for $500 and strips it for parts, he is trading in something quite specific, the crystallised labour time of another person. Marx, of course, called this commodity fetishism. The tendency to experience the social relations embedded in a commodity as properties of the thing itself. The Grandmaster Blacksmith account looks like an object with a market price. What it actually is 6 months of Troy Stoll's evenings and weekends. So Dibbell's 2007 New York Times Magazine article follows the question of virtual labour to its logical conclusion. If virtual economies generate real wealth, and if the labour of playing generates real income, then what does it look like when someone does this professionally? When the line between playing and working isn't philosophically blurry, but organisationally explicit? The answer is Lee Quen, sitting shirtless in a fluorescent lit office space in Nanjing, chain smoking, mouse clicking his wizard character through a wooded mountain terrain full of warrior monks. 12 hours a night, 7 nights a week, 2 or 3 nights off per month. For every 100 gold coins he collects in World of Warcraft, Lee earns 10 yen, about $1.25. His boss sells those same coins to an online retailer for $3 or more. The retailer sells it to the final customer, typically a player in North America or Europe, for up to $20. The margins at each step are real, so is the labour. This is a gold farm. At the time Dibbell was writing, there were estimated to be thousands of such operations across China, collectively employing around 100,000 workers and generating approximately $1.8 billion in annual trade in virtual goods. The polite industry name was Yushi Gongshushi. I wrote this down. I didn't really think about having to pronounce it out loud. Yushi Gongshushi. This is embarrassing.
Welcome to this pronunciation video. Today,
forget about it. Let's see. Yushi means games. Gongjushi, workroom, workshop, or studio. Okay. Yushi Gongshushi. Gongjushi. Yushi Gongshushi. To Western players, they're simply gold farms. Sorry, that threw me. But I'm not going to start again. This is a gold farm. So Dibbell's piece is full of moments that complicate an easy reading of what's happening. There is Ming Qing Hai, who gets killed in the game not by the warrior monks he's farming, but by another player, a Western player who has sought him out specifically, tracking the repetitive patterns of his harvesting route to identify him as a farmer. Ming can't fully understand the English language insults in the chat window, but he understands enough. I have this idea in mind, he says, that regular players should understand that people do different things in the game. They are playing, and we are making a living. That distinction, playing versus making a living, is the central problem of Dibbell's paper, but the distinction keeps dissolving. There's a moment when a high-level monster accidentally joins Min's fight. He grabs his mouse and starts to flee. He hunches over the keyboard, leaning into his run, flushed. His boss wanders over and cheers him on. After the monster breaks off the chase, Min says, "It's instinctual, you can't help it, you want to play." And there is Fang Yang Wen, a technical support worker at the gold farm, who in his off hours plays World of Warcraft on his own account with a top-level warlock so powerful that other workers pull their chairs over to watch. Fan once bought farmed gold himself because he didn't have time to farm it. When Dibbell asks whether his off-hours play is work or play, Fang shrugs. Both. But the most powerful passage in the piece is Min's account of the raid team. The the 40-person operation at Donghua Networks assembled to run players through endgame dungeons for $300 a ticket, giving customers access to items that gold farming couldn't reach. Min was the tank, the heavily armoured warrior, who holds the attention of the most powerful enemy in the fight, absorbing all its blows, keeping everyone else alive. If the tank dies, the raid wipes. The tank is the linchpin. Working together, playing together, it felt nice, Min says. Very schwang. The word means open, clear, exhilarating. You would go in, knowing that you were fighting the bosses that all the guilds in the world dream of fighting. There was a sense of achievement. When the raid team was shut down for lack of customers, Min quit and took a simple farming job. He couldn't stand being surrounded by reminders of something that had felt like the greatest guild on earth. The gold farm, as Dibbell presents it, is not simply a factory where people produce virtual goods instead of physical ones. It is a site where work-play distinction is an active, continuous negotiation by the workers themselves, from the inside, and the negotiation is not resolved. It remains genuinely open. While Dibbell is following value as it moves between game worlds and real-world markets, Chrisley Malone is looking at something happening entirely within the game, the moment when players, confronted with a distribution problem their game's own code doesn't adequately solve, invent their own economic institution from scratch. DKP stands for Dragon Kill Points, and it's among the most sociologically interesting inventions to emerge from the culture of MMO raiding. The problem DKP solves is structural. The most valuable content in World of Warcraft, the endgame raids, requires groups of up to 40 coordinated players. When a raid succeeds, a small number of items drops, far fewer than the number of players present. The game's own loot distribution systems, random rolls, need before greed options, are seen by serious raiding guilds as inadequate for governing who receives items that have taken months to become accessible at all. So guilds invent their own overlay, Dragon Kill Points. Participate in a raid, earn DKP. Claim an item when it drops, spend DKP. The amount you have accumulated and the amount you have spent are both tracked. Contribute more, claim more. Simple in principle, complex in execution. What makes DKP analytically interesting is what Malone shows it to be doing beyond simple distribution. DKP is simultaneously material capital. It functions like a currency, a store of value representing accumulated participation, and cultural capital, a credential that objectively indexes your experience, your commitment, and your time. The amount of DKP you hold is a quantified record of engagement. It cannot be faked, because it is earned only through presence at guild raids. One player in Malone's fieldwork put it precisely. Money people can get. DKP is sacred. That word, sacred, is worth pausing on. DKP cannot be purchased, cannot be earned outside the guild, cannot be converted into any real-world currency. Its value is entirely relational. It exists only within the social world of the guild, as a measure of reciprocal commitment. And the items purchased with DKP, particularly the bind-on pickup items that can only be obtained by being present at the kill, function as credentials in a very specific sense. When someone inspects your character and sees a piece of gear that drops from a particular dungeon, they know something about you. You were there. You were present and contributing. You participated in killing that boss. The item carries the history of its acquisition. It cannot be separated from it. Malone's own story of the Cold Snap wand illustrates this precisely. Cold Snap is a mage's weapon. Malone is a priest. When the only mage present passes on it, and she asks if she can have it as an upgrade for her character, the raid agrees. From that point, every mage who inspects her character cries, literally using an in-game emote for weeping. One player asks if she's ninja looted it, which would mean she stole it. Because a priest carrying a mage's wand is a statement about the guild. It means the guild has cleared so much content that they can afford to give what would normally be a prime item to someone who can only partially benefit from it. The item tells a story. It is a credential not just for Malone's character, but for the entire organisation she belongs to. The DKP system also generates obligations that extend beyond the game. Malone describes the phone tree, a system by which guild members were expected to be contactable 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to respond when real-world spawn bosses appeared. Sleep was not an accepted excuse for missing a call. The phone tree was external to the game's core entirely. It ran on real-world phones, in real time, interrupting real sleep. But it existed only because of the game. It crossed the boundary between the virtual world and everyday life in both directions simultaneously. This is Malone's key argument. DKP straddles the boundary between the synthetic world and the physical one. It belongs to neither. It exists in the space between them, created by the game but not of it, governing the distribution of things that exist in the game but matter outside it. And the obligations it generates, the phone tree at 2 a.m, or the pressure to participate in farming raids you find boring, the negative DKP balance that keeps you in a guild you might otherwise leave, are real obligations. They have real effects on real people's lives. So now we come to Tara Fickle's 2021 paper, which reframes everything we've looked at in this module. And it does so by asking a deceptively simple question. Why is gold farming reviled while esports is celebrated? The surface similarity is striking. Gold farming, as Dibbell documents it, young Asian men working long hours, communally housed, eating and sleeping together, playing video games under the supervision of a manager, for wages paid in direct proportion to their productive output. Esports, as any major tournament documents it, young Asian men working long hours, communally housed, eating and sleeping together, playing video games under the supervision of a coach or management team for salaries and prize money. The operations look alike. The demographics are remarkably similar, particularly in the early years of esports commercial development, when South Korean and Chinese players dominated every major title. The fundamental novelty, being paid to play games for a living, is identical. And yet, gold farming was aggressively prosecuted by game companies, condemned by Western players in language that Dibbell himself notes echoed 19th century US anti-Chinese immigrant rhetoric. Vermin. Extermination. YouTube compilations titled Chinese Gold Farmers Must Die. While esports was celebrated as a new frontier, a legitimate sporting endeavour, a spectacle to fill arenas and generate celebrity athletes. Fickle's argument is that this difference is not produced by any genuine difference in the activity. It's produced by what she calls Ludo-Orientalism, the deployment of long-standing Orientalist assumptions about Asian bodies, labour and authenticity to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate forms of productive play. If this argument feels familiar, it should. Fletcher, in week 6, describes how whiteness in online gaming spaces functions as symbolic capital, not experienced as advantage, but as simply being normal, the unmarked position against which everything else is defined as other. Fickle is describing the same mechanism from another angle. Ludo-Orientalism is the constitutive outside of the magic circle of whiteness. It does not only centre the white player as the default legitimate subject. It simultaneously marks Asian labour as the default illegitimate one. The two operations are mutually constitutive. Esports needs gold farming to be illegitimate for the same reason the magic circle of whiteness needs the outsider. Legitimacy is defined by contrast, and the contrast is drawn along racial lines. Gold farming is framed as Chinese labour contaminating a Western cultural product, as cheating, as ruining the game, as a grey market industry gone underground. Esports is framed as global competition that happens ironically to be dominated by Asians, a fact that produces discomfort, but is accommodated within a discourse of athletic excellence and deserved meritocratic achievement. The racialization is visible in the language produced around these practices, and also the institutional responses to them. Blizzard, as Dibbell reports, banned more than 50,000 World of Warcraft accounts belonging to gold farmers, but as Blizzard's own executive explained, with unusual candour, Cracking down on the farmers was better business than cracking down on the buyers. The buyers were paying customers who would go on the forums and say really nasty things if sanctioned. The farmers were Chinese workers operating in a grey market. The political economy of the crackdowns was not primarily about fairness. It was about which side of the market it was profitable to antagonise. Fickle's sharpest insight is this. Gold farming and esports are not opposites. They are foils, held apart precisely because they are so similar. And the difference between them is maintained through the work of racial capitalism. This is not simply an accusation of hypocrisy against game companies. It is a structural argument. The legitimation of esports and the delegitimization of gold farming are mutually constitutive. Each makes sense only in relation to the other. Esports needs gold farming to be illegitimate so that its own legitimacy can be established. And the line between them is drawn not by the nature of the activity, but by the racialized logic that determines whose labour counts as a form of play and whose play counts as a form of labour. Fickle takes this further in her analysis of Ji Jing's documentary Gold Farmers, the film that brought the phenomenon to wide academic attention. She shows how the visual grammar of the documentary, in representing Chinese gold farm workers, participates in what she calls high-tech Orientalism, a mode of representation in which the Asian body is rendered as data, as transmission, as a conduit for information flows rather than as a subject with interiority. The workers are pixelated into the flickering lights of modems. They are rendered invisible and visible simultaneously, presented as labour, absent as persons. This, Fickle argues, is not incidental to the representation, but constitutive of how gold farming has been understood, as a phenomenon to be analysed at the level of economics or technology, not at the level of people doing it. So, we've looked at 4 readings. Let's put them together. So, starting with Dibbell, in his first piece, he establishes that virtual economies are real economies, that virtual labour produces real value, and that the line between play and work has already dissolved in the early years of commercial MMOs, long before the academic apparatus has caught up with what is happening on the ground. In his piece in 2007, he follows that dissolution into the bodies of workers, into the fluorescent lit offices, the repetitive mouse clicks, the moment when the instinct to play breaks through the routines of production, and the collective experience of tanking a dragon together that is neither purely work nor purely play, but something for which neither word is adequate. Malone shows us players constructing their own economic institutions in response to the game's inadequacies. Institutions that generate real obligations, real credentials, and real forms of capital that belong neither to the game world nor to the physical world, but to the space between them. And Fickle insists that all this takes place within structures of racial capitalism that determine whose labour is legitimate, whose play is authentic, and who gets to be recognised as an athlete rather than prosecuted as a cheater. What connects all 4 is a single underlying problem, the work-play distinction, which we inherited from industrial capitalism and which assumed that work was productive and play was not. But this turns out to be inadequate, not just for understanding virtual economies, but as a general account of how human effort and value are related. In virtual worlds, that inadequacy becomes spectacularly visible. Burke saw it in the eBay farmers who exposed the labour-like quality of maximising. Malaby saw it in Ludo-Capitalism, institutions harnessing the playful disposition to extract value while appearing merely to offer a game. Dibbell saw it in Mingqing Hai, who couldn't stop playing even when he was paid to. Malone saw it in the phone tree that woke people up at 2 a.m. And Fickle sees it in the entire apparatus of racial capitalism that means distinction not by logic but by power. This is where the 3 threads we've been tracking all semester arrive together. The boundary question finds its answer in the negative. There is no stable boundary. Virtual capital is real capital. Virtual labour produces real value. The consequences of what happens in a game extend into finances, sleep, and phones ringing at 2 a.m. The boundary was always a fiction maintained by those with an interest in maintaining it. Developers who preferred not to acknowledge that their players were workers. Game companies that found it more profitable to ban farmers than buyers. And the assumed player question also finds its sharpest expression here. Fickle shows that the category of the legitimate player, the authentic gamer, is racialized. The assumed player of competitive gaming culture is not only gendered male, as in Drenton, and centred as white, as in Akil Fletcher, but positioned as a particular kind of economic subject, a consumer of leisure, not a producer of value. The gold farmer disrupts all three assumptions simultaneously, which is why the reaction was so extreme and the language so violent. The play-work question turns out not to have a single answer. Troy Stoll says it's not work if you enjoy it, and he is both right and wrong. Min Kun Hai is paid to play and cannot stop himself from playing even when he is. Fang Yang Wen says both. Malone's phone tree wakes people up at 2 a.m. for a game obligation. What these cases collectively reveal is not that the distinction is simply wrong, but that it is made, not found. It is a distinction that serves particular interests, is enforced by particular institutions, and is drawn through particular bodies along lines of race, geography, and class. So for your fieldwork, who is doing the labour in your game world? Who farms the resources, runs the lower level content, provides the goods and services that the more advanced players depend on? What does the community's treatment of these players tell you about how value is distributed, and how that distribution is justified? Are you inside a structure of Ludo-Capitalism without knowing it? These questions connect everything we've done this semester. Geertz's question, what is actually at stake here, and for whom, turns out to be an economic question as well as a symbolic one. Winner's question, whose interests did the design serve, turns out to apply to the game's economy as well as its interface. Bourdieu's question, what forms of capital are circulating and how do they convert, turns out to require a theory of labour as well as a theory of status. And the magic circle, what Consalvo told us in week 2 was not the sealed space Heisinger described, turns out to be something more specific. A boundary drawn to separate legitimate play from illegitimate labour, maintained by institutional power and marked unmistakably by race. So keep playing, keep looking, and keep asking who drew the line and why.